June 9, 1912. The evening air in Villisca, Iowa hung thick with the promise of summer storms, though the sky remained clear above the modest two-story house at 508 East 2nd Street. Inside, the Moore family prepared for bed after returning from the Children's Day program at the Presbyterian Church, their voices carrying the contented exhaustion of a community evening well spent. Josiah Moore, 43 years old and a respected businessman in this railroad town of 2,500 souls, checked the front door one final time before retiring. The lock turned easily, a formality more than a necessity in a place where neighbors knew each other's histories back 3 generations, and crime meant little more than drunken arguments on Saturday nights. Sarah Moore, 39 and devoted to her husband and 4 children, ensured that the 2 visiting girls were comfortable in the downstairs guest room. Ina May and Lena Gertrude Stillinger, ages 8 and 12, had been invited by the Moore daughter Mary Catherine to spend the night. A simple childhood pleasure that would transform into something unspeakably tragic before the sun rose again. The house settled into its nightly rhythm. Upstairs, Herman Moore, 11, shared a bed with his 7-year-old brother Arthur, their whispered conversations about the evening's program gradually fading into sleep. 10-year-old Mary Catherine and little Paul, only 5, occupied the 3rd bedroom, their excitement about their overnight guests slowly giving way to drowsiness. By midnight, 508 East 2nd Street held 8 sleeping souls, none aware that death was already moving toward their door with methodical purpose. The killer approached through streets he knew intimately, past houses where he had shared meals and conversations, toward a family whose routines he understood with the precision of someone who belonged to their world. He knew that Josiah Moore kept his axe in the basement for splitting kindling. He knew which floorboards creaked and which rooms lay closest to the street where sounds might carry to neighboring homes. The front door opened without resistance. The killer stepped into the parlor where the Moore family had gathered hours earlier, letting his eyes adjust to the darkness. The house breathed around him with the familiar sounds of old wood settling, water moving through pipes, the distant tick of a mantel clock marking time that would soon lose all meaning for those sleeping above. He moved toward the basement stairs, his feet finding their way without hesitation. In the cool darkness below, his hands located the axe among the tools that Josiah had arranged with the careful precision of a man who earned his living through honest work. The handle felt solid, familiar, an implement of labor about to become an instrument of annihilation. The killer climbed back to the main floor, then ascended the narrow staircase that would take him to the bedrooms where the Moore family slept. Each step had been planned, rehearsed in his mind until the sequence became as natural as breathing. This was not the work of sudden rage or desperate impulse. This was the methodical execution of a design that had taken shape over weeks, perhaps months of careful observation and planning. He entered the master bedroom first. Josiah Moore lay on his back, one arm across his chest, sleeping with the deep rest of a man whose conscience was clear. The first blow fell with enough force to crush the skull instantly, eliminating any possibility of outcry. But the killer did not stop there. He continued striking, 30 blows in total, until Josiah Moore's face was destroyed beyond recognition. Tell us from where are you watching this video by writing in the comments so that we can know how far our videos are reaching, and do subscribe so that you keep getting regular thrilling stories that are to come next. Sarah Moore stirred at the sound, perhaps sensing rather than hearing the violence occurring beside her. She opened her eyes to darkness made absolute by death's approach. The axe found her before she could fully wake, before she could scream or fight or understand what was happening in her own bedroom. Like her husband, she was struck repeatedly, far beyond what death required, an excess of violence that spoke to rage beyond ordinary human comprehension. The killer paused, listening to the house around him. No sounds of alarm, no stirring from the children's rooms. He had worked with such swift efficiency that the rest of the family remained undisturbed, trusting in sleep's false promise of safety. He moved to the adjacent bedroom where Herman and Arthur slept side by side. The 11-year-old never woke, nor did his younger brother. The axe fell with the same systematic precision that had characterized the adult murders, each blow calculated to ensure silence and finality. In the third upstairs bedroom, Mary Catherine and little Paul suffered the same fate. The killer showed no hesitation, no mercy for their age or innocence. They were obstacles to be eliminated, witnesses who could never be allowed to speak of what they might have seen or heard. But the night's work was not finished. Downstairs, in the guest bedroom, the Stillinger sisters lay sleeping in a bed that should have represented friendship and childhood joy. Instead, it had become a trap from which there would be no escape. Lena Stillinger, the older girl, awakened as the killer approached. Perhaps some instinct warned her, or perhaps she had heard sounds from above that her conscious mind couldn't quite identify. She opened her eyes to see a figure in the doorway, silhouetted against the faint light from a street lamp beyond the windows. She tried to wake her sister, tried to shield her with her own small body, tried to fight off an adult whose strength made resistance futile. The defensive wounds on her arms would later tell investigators that at least one victim had been awake, had known what was happening, had fought desperately for life that was already forfeit. Ina May Stillinger died beside her sister, the last victim in a house where childhood had ended forever. The killer stood over their bodies, breathing heavily from his exertions, surveying the completion of his work. But he was not finished. Something in him required additional ritual, further desecration of the scene he had created. He moved through the house, covering every mirror with clothing or bed sheets, as if unable to bear his own reflection in the aftermath of what he had done. He draped fabric over the faces of his victims, obscuring the evidence of his brutality even from his own eyes. Every window was covered, every source of outside observation blocked. The killer had created a tomb within the Moore house, a sealed chamber where 8 lives had been extinguished with mechanical precision. He left the axe in the guest bedroom, propped against the wall with an almost casual air, as if it were simply a tool returned to its proper place after use. Then he walked through the house one final time, ensuring that his work was complete, that no detail had been overlooked. The front door closed behind him, as quietly as it had opened. The killer walked away through streets where his neighbors slept peacefully, unaware that something monstrous had occurred within shouting distance of their own beds. He returned to his own home, his own family, his own life of respected respectability. Dawn came slowly to Villisca on June 10, 1912. The sun rose on a town that looked exactly as it had the morning before, but everything had changed. At 508 East 2nd Street, 8 bodies lay cooling in rooms that would never again know the sounds of ordinary life. It was Mary Peckham, a neighbor, who first sensed something wrong. The Moore house sat too quiet, too still for a Monday morning when Josiah should have been preparing for work and Sarah should have been tending to breakfast duties. The window shades remained drawn at an hour when the family routinely welcomed daylight into their home. Peckham's calls received no answer. Her knocks at the door produced only silence. As morning progressed and the Moore house remained sealed and unresponsive, other neighbors gathered, their concern growing into alarm. Ross Moore, Josiah's brother, was summoned from his nearby home. He too found no response to his calls, no sign of life within the structure that should have been bustling with Monday morning activity. The front door was locked, but the back door yielded to his attempt. Ross Moore stepped into a house transformed. The covered windows created an artificial darkness that his eyes struggled to penetrate. The air held a thickness, a quality that his nose identified before his mind could accept what it meant. He called out again, his voice echoing strangely in spaces that seemed to absorb sound rather than return it. He found them in the guest bedroom first. The Stillinger sisters lying in their bed, their faces covered with fabric, their bodies positioned as if sleep had simply deepened beyond waking. But the dark stains on the bedding, the terrible stillness of forms that should have been breathing told a different story. Ross Moore's cries brought neighbors running. Dr. J. Clark Cooper arrived to confirm what everyone already knew but couldn't yet accept. 8 people had died violently in the heart of Villisca, in a house where such things were supposed to be impossible. The news spread through the town with the speed that only genuine catastrophe can achieve. Within hours, Hundreds of people had gathered at 508 East 2nd Street, drawn by horror and disbelief in equal measure. The crime scene was contaminated before any systematic investigation could begin. Curious onlookers trampling evidence and handling objects that might have revealed the killer's identity. Detective J.J. Wilkerson arrived from the state office, but the damage was already done. The house that might have told the story of the killer's movements had been transformed into a carnival of morbid curiosity. Fingerprints were destroyed, trace evidence was scattered, and potential clues were lost forever in the chaos of community shock. The investigation that followed would consume months and produce numerous suspects but no definitive answers. Traveling men were questioned, local residents with grievances against Josiah Moore were investigated, and theories ranging from the plausible to the fantastic were pursued with varying degrees of competence. Reverend George Kelly emerged as the primary suspect, a traveling preacher whose presence in nearby towns had coincided with similar axe murders. Kelly was a man whose religious fervor had curdled into something darker, whose sermons about sin and punishment carried undertones that disturbed even his faithful congregations. He was tried twice for the Villisca murders. The first trial ended in a hung jury, unable to reach consensus on evidence that seemed both compelling and insufficient. The second trial resulted in acquittal, the jury finding reasonable doubt in a case built on circumstantial evidence and psychological speculation rather than physical proof. Other suspects came and went. Frank Fernando Jones, a prominent local businessman who had feuded with Josiah Moore over business matters, fell under suspicion but was eventually cleared. William Blackie Mansfield, a cocaine addict with a history of violence, confessed to the murders but later recanted, claiming his admission had been coerced. The investigation revealed the social tensions that existed beneath Villisca's surface of small-town harmony. Business rivalries, personal grudges, and family disputes that had seemed minor in life took on sinister significance in death. Everyone in town became both potential suspect and suspicious observer, trust dissolving under the weight of unsolved murder. Years passed. The Moore house stood empty, too associated with horror for any family to call it home. Curiosity seekers broke in to walk through rooms where 8 people had died, searching for souvenirs or sensations that would let them touch tragedy from a safe distance. The case files grew thick with false confessions, crackpot theories, and investigative dead ends. Every few years, someone would claim to have solved the mystery, only to have their solution crumble under scrutiny. The Villisca Axe murders became a puzzle that attracted amateur detectives and professional investigators alike, all convinced they could succeed where others had failed. But the house itself remembered everything. It held the echo of footsteps in rooms where no one walked, the whisper of voices in spaces where no one spoke, the presence of 8 lives that had been cut short by someone who walked among their neighbors for years afterward, carrying the knowledge of what he had done in the early hours of June 10, 1912. In 1994, the house was purchased and restored to its 1912 appearance, opening to the public as a museum and overnight lodging for those brave enough to sleep where the Moore family had died. Visitors came seeking ghosts and found instead something more disturbing: the realization that evil could wear the mask of respectability, that killers could live undetected in communities that thought they knew everyone's secrets. The restored house draws investigators, ghost hunters, and curiosity seekers from around the world. They come with modern equipment and contemporary theories, convinced that technology or psychology or some combination of both can solve what early 20th century investigation could not. But the mystery endures not because of insufficient evidence, but because it represents a type of crime that challenges our basic assumptions about human nature and community life. Someone in Villisca knew the Moore family well enough to walk into their house and kill them all, and that someone was skilled enough or lucky enough to escape justice entirely. The killer possessed detailed knowledge of the Moore household, felt comfortable spending considerable time in the house after the murders, and showed no apparent concern about leaving evidence that might identify him. This suggested either remarkable confidence or the certainty that he would not be suspected, a confidence that implies either official position, family connections, or social standing sufficient to deflect serious investigation. The systematic nature of the murders, the ritual covering of mirrors and faces, The careful blocking of windows all speak to someone who understood the symbolic as well as practical aspects of his actions. This was not merely killing, but obliteration, the complete erasure of a family from existence. Most disturbing of all is the recognition that the killer returned to his ordinary life after the murders, attended the victims' funerals, comforted neighbors who expressed fear about the unsolved crimes, and lived out his natural life while carrying secrets too terrible for ordinary consciousness to accommodate. The Villisca Axe murders represent more than a single crime. They represent the shattering of a community's faith in its own capacity for self-knowledge, the recognition that monsters can wear familiar faces and walk among us undetected for decades. The house at 508 East 2nd Street continues to draw visitors because it forces confrontation with uncomfortable truths about human nature. Somewhere in Iowa in 1912, a man committed 8 murders and lived with that knowledge until death claimed him as surely as he had claimed his victims. He shook hands and made small talk and maintained his facade of respectability, while 8 graves in the Villisca Cemetery held evidence of his capacity for unthinkable violence. The mystery endures because it reflects the terrifying possibility that our neighbors, our friends, our fellow community members may be fundamentally unknowable. The Moore family trusted their killer enough to leave their door unlocked, felt secure enough in their community standing to invite neighborhood children for sleepovers, believed in the safety that small-town life was supposed to provide. Their murders shattered not just their lives but their town's understanding of itself. Someone among them had been capable of extraordinary evil while maintaining the appearance of ordinary respectability, and that someone was never identified, never punished, never forced to account for the 8 lives he had stolen from the world. Today, visitors to the Villisca house confront the enduring power of this unsolved mystery. They walk through rooms where children once played, and families once gathered, where death came calling with methodical purpose and left behind questions that more than a century has failed to answer. The case files remain open. The house stands as a monument to mysteries that resist solution and communities that must live with the knowledge that their understanding of themselves and each other may be fatally incomplete. The Villisca Axe murders haunt America, not because of supernatural phenomena, but because they remind us that the greatest horror stories are not about ghosts, but about the living, not about what might lurk in darkness, but about what walks among us in daylight, wearing the mask of respectability. 8 people died in Villisca on June 10, 1912. Their killer was someone's neighbor, someone's friend, someone's fellow church member. He lived with his secret until natural death claimed him, taking with him the answers that justice demanded but never received. The house remembers his work. The town never learned his name.